There is a particular kind of suffering that affects empaths differently. It is not simply the pain of being hurt. It is the pain of having your understanding of people challenged. Because for many empaths, the deepest wound is not what happened to them. It is the realization that the goodness they saw in others was not always matched by the reality of who those people truly were. Empaths move through the world with a unique lens. They are naturally attuned to emotional undercurrents. They notice what others overlook. They sense pain behind anger, insecurity behind arrogance, and fear behind cruelty. This ability can be a gift. It allows them to connect deeply, forgive generously, and create meaningful relationships. But it also carries a hidden danger. When you become highly skilled at understanding why people behave the way they do, you can begin to excuse behaviors that should never be tolerated. Many empaths spend years believing that if they can just understand someone enough, they can maintain the relationship. If they can see the wounded child behind the difficult adult, if they can identify the trauma beneath the harmful behavior, then perhaps they can love that person into becoming better. But life eventually introduces a painful contradiction. Understanding someone does not guarantee that they will change. Recognizing another person's wounds does not heal them, and seeing the best in someone does not mean that the best is what they consistently choose to become. This realization often arrives through heartbreak. Sometimes it comes through betrayal by a partner. Sometimes through a friendship that turns one-sided. Sometimes through family dynamics that have quietly drained emotional energy for years. Regardless of the form it takes, the experience forces a confrontation with reality. And reality can feel brutal when it collides with hope. What makes this stage particularly difficult is that empaths are not naive because they lack intelligence. In fact, many are exceptionally perceptive. Their challenge is different. They tend to focus on potential rather than patterns. They become fascinated by who a person could be rather than paying attention to who that person repeatedly demonstrates themselves to be. Psychologically, this reflects a deeply human tendency. We all create narratives to make sense of our relationships. We tell ourselves stories about people. We build explanations around their actions. We interpret contradictions in ways that preserve our emotional investments. But empaths often take this process further because their capacity for compassion is so expansive. They become caretakers of possibility, and in doing so, they sometimes abandon reality. The darkness begins when those stories can no longer survive contact with the truth. A person you trusted lies repeatedly. Someone you supported disappears when you need them most. A relationship that seemed built on mutual care reveals itself to be sustained primarily by your effort. These moments create a fracture, not only in the relationship but in the world, you that supported it. Suddenly you are forced to ask difficult questions. How did I not see this? Why did I ignore the signs? Why did I keep giving when I was receiving so little in return? The temptation is to respond with self-judgment. Many empaths emerge from painful experiences, feeling embarrassed by their own generosity. They begin to see their compassion as weakness. Their trust feels foolish, their openness feels dangerous, but this interpretation misses something important. The problem was never compassion itself. The problem was compassion operating without discernment. There is a profound difference between understanding someone's pain and becoming responsible for it. There is a difference between supporting someone's growth and sacrificing your own well-being in the process. Yet many empaths only learn this distinction after experiencing significant emotional loss. This is why darkness can become such a powerful teacher. Not because suffering is inherently noble, not because pain automatically creates wisdom, but because certain truths are difficult to access without first experiencing disillusionment. Disillusionment sounds negative, but if we examine the word closely, its meaning becomes surprisingly liberating. To become disillusioned is not to lose truth. It is to lose an illusion, and those are not the same thing. The illusion says that love alone can change people. Reality says people change when they choose to. The illusion says that endless patience guarantees appreciation. Reality says some people mistake patience for permission. The illusion says that seeing goodness in others protects us. Reality says goodness must be balanced with clear observation. When these illusions fall away, something remarkable begins to emerge: clarity. For perhaps the first time, the empath starts seeing people as they are rather than as they hope they will become. This shift changes everything. It changes relationships because attention moves from promises to behavior. It changes trust because trust becomes something earned rather than automatically granted. It changes self-worth because value is no longer measured by how much one can endure for others. And perhaps most importantly, it changes the relationship with suffering itself. Before this transformation, pain often feels like evidence that something has gone wrong. Afterward, pain becomes information, it becomes feedback, it becomes a signal directing attention toward truths that have been ignored. This does not make the experience easy. The collapse of illusion is rarely graceful. It can feel like grief because in many ways it is grief. You are mourning not only a person or a relationship, but an entire way of seeing the world. You are letting go of stories that once gave meaning and security. You are releasing identities built around rescuing, fixing, and carrying others. And yet, beneath that grief lies the beginning of freedom. Because when reality is finally accepted, energy that was once spent maintaining illusions becomes available for something far more valuable: wisdom. Wisdom does not make us cynical. Wisdom allows us to remain open without becoming vulnerable to every demand. Wisdom allows us to care deeply without losing ourselves. Wisdom allows us to recognize that empathy reaches its highest form not when it ignores truth, but when it stands beside truth. The broken empath discovers that seeing clearly is not the opposite of loving deeply. It is the condition that makes healthy love possible. And that realization marks the first stage of transformation. Because the moment you stop asking who people could become and start paying attention to who they consistently choose to be, you reclaim a power that no betrayal can take away. Once an empath begins to see reality more clearly, a new challenge emerges. And in many ways, this challenge is even more difficult than the first. Because seeing the truth about others is one thing. Acting on that truth is something else entirely. This is where the real transformation begins. For years, many empaths have built their identity around being available, being understanding, being the person who stays when others leave. They become the emotional anchor in relationships, the problem solver in families, the listener in friendships, the one who absorbs tension so that everyone else can remain comfortable. At first, this role feels meaningful. It creates a sense of purpose. Being needed can feel remarkably similar to being valued. Being relied upon can feel remarkably similar to being loved. But eventually, a difficult question appears. What happens when your entire sense of worth depends on what you provide for others? This question strikes at the heart of the empath's journey. Because many people who are highly empathetic were not simply taught to care about others, they were often taught, directly or indirectly, to prioritize others. Somewhere along the way, they learned that harmony was more important than honesty, that accommodation was safer than disagreement, that meeting the needs of others was the price of maintaining connection. Over time, this creates a subtle but profound imbalance. The empath becomes highly skilled at recognizing the emotional needs of everyone around them, while becoming increasingly disconnected from their own. They know when someone else is exhausted. They know when someone else feels neglected. They know when someone else is hurting. Yet when it comes to their own exhaustion, neglect, and pain, they often hesitate. They minimize it. They rationalize it, They tell themselves they can handle a little more understanding, a little more patience, a little more sacrifice, and because they are capable of enduring so much, they often do. Until they can't. This is the moment many people describe as breaking, but perhaps breaking is not the most accurate word. Perhaps what is actually happening is an awakening. Because eventually the empath realizes something that changes everything. Self-abandonment is not love. It never was. No matter how noble it appeared, no matter how compassionate it felt, no matter how many people praised it, there is a difference between generosity and self-erasure, and many empaths spend years confusing the two. This confusion is understandable. Society often celebrates people who give endlessly. We admire selflessness. We praise sacrifice. We tell stories about devotion and loyalty. Yet rarely do we discuss the cost of relationships that require one person to disappear in order for another person to thrive. The truth is that healthy relationships are not sustained by unlimited giving. They are sustained by reciprocity. Not perfect equality, not constant balance, but mutual regard. A recognition that both people's needs matter. A recognition that care must flow in both directions. The empath who survives darkness begins to understand this in a deeply personal way. They begin to notice patterns they once ignored. They notice how often they say yes when they mean no. They notice how quickly they take responsibility for other people's emotions. They notice how uncomfortable they feel when someone is disappointed with them. And perhaps most importantly, they notice how much of their life has been organized around avoiding rejection. This is where boundaries enter the story, and boundaries are often misunderstood. Many people imagine boundaries as walls. They imagine coldness, distance, or selfishness. They imagine a withdrawal of care, but true boundaries are none of those things. A boundary is not an act of punishment. It is an act of clarity. It is a way of saying, this is where I end and you begin. Without that distinction, relationships become confusing. Resentment accumulates, responsibility becomes blurred, people start carrying burdens that were never theirs to carry. The empath's challenge is that boundaries often feel unnatural at first. When you have spent years measuring your value through service, saying no can feel like failure. When you have spent years preventing discomfort, allowing someone to experience disappointment can feel cruel. When you have spent years earning connection through accommodation, expressing your own needs can feel selfish. But these feelings are not evidence that boundaries are wrong. They are evidence that old patterns are being challenged. Growth frequently feels uncomfortable precisely because it requires us to behave differently than we have behaved before. The empath who is healing learns to tolerate that discomfort. They learn that another person's reaction does not automatically determine whether a decision is healthy. They learn that guilt is not always a signal to change course. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional residue of outgrowing an unhealthy role. This realization is profoundly liberating, because for the first time, the empath stops managing relationships through fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing others, fear of being misunderstood. Instead, they begin managing relationships through self-respect. And self-respect changes the entire landscape of human connection. It alters who gains access to your energy. It alters what behaviors you tolerate. It alters the standards you apply to your relationships. Most importantly, it alters the relationship you have with yourself. For perhaps the first time, your needs become visible, not because they are more important than anyone else's, but because they are equally important. This is a radical shift. Many empaths have spent so long extending compassion outward that they have forgotten how to direct it inward. They offer others understanding while denying it to themselves. They forgive others repeatedly while remaining harshly critical of their own imperfections. They protect others from suffering while accepting unnecessary suffering in their own lives. Healing requires reversing this imbalance. Not through narcissism, not through self-absorption, but through inclusion. The self is finally invited into the circle of compassion. And when that happens, something remarkable occurs. The empath becomes stronger without becoming harder. This distinction matters because many people fear that boundaries will transform them into someone they do not want to become. They fear becoming cold, detached, indifferent, but genuine healing does not destroy sensitivity, it refines it. The healed empath still cares deeply, still listens, still understands, still offers kindness. The difference is that compassion is no longer offered at the expense of self-respect. And that changes everything, because a person who has boundaries does not love less. They love more honestly. They give more consciously. They remain present without becoming consumed. They support without rescuing. They care without carrying. This is the rebirth that follows the collapse of illusion. The empath stops defining themselves by how much pain they can endure for others, and begins defining themselves by how truthfully they can live. And in that shift, they discover something they may have spent years searching for in other people. A sense of safety, not because the world has become safer, not because people have become more predictable, but because they have finally become someone they can trust. When an empath reaches this stage of the journey, something extraordinary begins to happen. Not all at once, not through a sudden revelation, and certainly not because the pain disappears. The wounds remain part of the story. The memories remain. The disappointments remain. But their relationship to those experiences changes. The darkness is no longer something they are trying to escape. It becomes something they have learned from. And that distinction marks the emergence of a rare kind of power. Many people assume power comes from control. Control over circumstances, control over outcomes, control over other people. Yet life has a way of exposing the limits of all these forms of power. No matter how intelligent, caring, or prepared we are, there will always be things we cannot control. People will make choices we do not understand. Relationships will change. Expectations will be broken. Loss will arrive uninvited. The empath who has survived the darkness understands this deeply because they have already experienced what happens when control becomes a substitute for trust. For years, they may have tried to prevent pain by anticipating everyone's needs. They may have monitored emotional climates, adjusted their behavior to keep peace, and carried responsibilities that were never theirs. In many ways, they became experts in emotional management. But true emotional mastery is something very different. Emotional management often begins with fear. Emotional mastery begins with awareness. One seeks to control feelings. The other seeks to understand them. And this is where the transformed empath gains an advantage that cannot be taught through theory alone. They have lived inside emotional complexity. They have experienced betrayal without losing the capacity for love. They have experienced disappointment without abandoning hope. They have experienced grief without surrendering to bitterness. As a result, they begin to develop a relationship with emotions that is far more sophisticated than simple reactions. They stop asking, "How do I avoid pain?" and they begin asking, "What is this experience trying to teach me?" This shift sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Because suffering becomes information rather than identity, many people become trapped in painful experiences because they build a self-concept around them. They become the abandoned person, the betrayed person, the rejected person, the overlooked person, and while those experiences may be real, they are not the entirety of who someone is. The healed empath learns to separate experience from identity. They recognize that pain is something they moved through, not something they permanently become. This creates an extraordinary level of psychological freedom. Because once pain is no longer defining you, It can begin informing you. It can sharpen perception. It can deepen understanding. It can reveal patterns that were previously invisible. One of the most fascinating developments during this stage is the empath's growing ability to read human behavior with greater accuracy. Not because they become suspicious, not because they become cynical, but because they finally learn to combine empathy with observation. Earlier in life, empathy often operated alone. They felt what people felt. They understood motivations. They saw vulnerabilities, but now another element joins the equation: discernment. Discernment asks different questions. It asks not only what a person feels, but how they act. Not only what they promise, but what they consistently do. Not only what they intend, but what impact they create. This combination of compassion and discernment is extraordinarily powerful, because it allows the empath to remain connected to humanity without becoming vulnerable to every expression of it. They no longer confuse explanations with excuses. They no longer mistake potential for character. They no longer interpret emotional intensity as emotional depth. Instead, they learn one of the most important truths in human relationships. People reveal themselves through patterns, not performances. And once you understand patterns, relationships become easier to navigate. You stop investing years trying to decode contradictions. You stop chasing validation from people incapable of offering it. You stop negotiating with realities that have already revealed themselves. Clarity replaces confusion, and with clarity comes peace. But perhaps the greatest transformation occurs in the empath's relationship with influence. Earlier in life, many empaths unconsciously believed their purpose was to heal others, to rescue, to guide, to fix. This often created enormous pressure because it placed responsibility for other people's growth on their shoulders. The healed empath discovers a more mature understanding of influence. They realize that genuine influence rarely comes from changing people. It comes from embodying truth. People are not transformed because someone persuades them. They are often transformed because someone models a different way of being. This is why survivors of darkness frequently become powerful teachers, mentors, leaders, and guides. Not because they possess perfect answers, but because they possess credibility. Their wisdom has been tested. Their insights have been earned. When they speak about boundaries, they understand what it means to have none. When they speak about self-respect, they remember what it felt like to abandon themselves. When they speak about healing, they are not discussing an abstract concept. They are describing a path they have walked, and people respond to that authenticity, not perfection. Authenticity, because authenticity carries a kind of authority that performance never can. There is also a profound philosophical shift that occurs during this stage. The empath stops seeing life as a struggle between light and darkness. Instead, they begin recognizing the relationship between the two. Without darkness, many of their deepest strengths would never have emerged. Without